With the unemployment in the country reaching a 13-year high at 27.1%, and Deputy President Cyril Rampahosa this past Sunday announcing a proposed minimum wage of 3,500 rands per month, South Africa faces a tough road ahead, with many worried about the labor implications of such a wage level and others demanding that it simply is not enough. The growing rate of unemployment and slowed economic growth raise questions about the future of the National Development Plan and the policy choices that the government should make to get the country out of the doldrums. Joining us to discuss these issues is Xhanti Payi, who's Director, Nasccence Research Advisory, and he's with us here. Xhanti, pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks for having me again.
Well, we're having a lot of not so good news. The inflation rate itself high, particularly food inflation at 12%, high unemployment rate, high inequality levels, high poverty levels, minimum wage being proposed. Not, where do you start? And we were told not so long ago that National Development Plan will work provided the country grows at 5% a year, starting already last year. And we are nowhere near that. We're what? Around zero? Hopefully, something happening within the next few months. So all of these things taken together, what do we do with them? Where would you start?
Look, I think first we have to actually be very clear about the pictures being painted here.
Yes.
So inflation is what actually eats away at our incomes.
Yes.
So we know that, as prices of food and everything else that we consume go up, it means our incomes come down. But also in terms of what households also are earning, because we're also seeing job losses in those numbers. So that actually in a household, you might have had 2 income earners. Now you have half that if somebody was in manufacturing. Yes. And they lost their job. So you had half the income because somebody lost a job, but also whatever the second income is now lower because prices are going up. Now this is a very dire situation for just ordinary people. So this is a very bad picture. And I think at the same time, what we always talk about, and I think we have to keep reminding ourselves of this, that we don't start at economic growth at 5%. We start at what people are doing to deliver the economic growth at 5%. So, and I think our mindset has been set that hopefully we will achieve this magical number and it will trickle down. Remember, we have said for many years that trickle-down effect is not a useful number. So what we want to do is to get people working, manufacturing cars, being hairdressers, sewing clothes, and that is what actually gets us to the 5% because we add that economic activity to get to GDP growth of 5%. Sure. And I think, what we have been failing at, therefore, is to say, what is it that we can do to make sure every single person in South Africa participates? And our discussion has always been about transformation. And I think we should be saying, what do we do about inclusion for these millions of people who are actually outside economic activity, who cannot feed themselves, that depend on the government? So one of the things we have to do is to actually, be very, very specific. You mentioned the NDP. The NDP is very clear about some of the things that we need to do, but what are the strategies on a small base level? And the government is clearly not coming very clearly.
But here's the thing, Xhanti, and I want to deal with these issues on a one-by-one basis because I just put them together in one basket and it will complicate the matter. But the typical response from government when these topics come up, the typical, even in fact, particularly in Parliament, the typical response is, we've got a plan. As if the plan will make problems go away, isn't it?
Yes, and sometimes we'll say we have a policy. Yes. Actually, it's much better when we have a plan, because a plan at least is a strategic thing that we're going to do A, B, C, and D to get to E.
Right.
We have policies which are very roundabout discussion documents that allow us maybe to think about the problem and to look at what might be a solution.
Yes.
What we actually need are very strategic line-by-line items. And I think I'm starting to sound like, that broken clock. One of the things, if we think about agriculture, again, just on a simple planning basis, what do we do about making sure that we don't have droughts? So food prices are going up because we had a drought. But we are not animals in the field. We are not in 1920. We know that every 7 to 10 years, we will have a drought.
Yes.
Which means we have to plan for it. The infrastructure to store water, irrigation systems when it rains, the crops that we plant. Remember, we are in the new century. Agriculturists know how to now actually make crops that are resistant to this thing. So why is it that we didn't have that sort of infrastructure to actually make sure that this is not as dramatic a problem as it is? And I think these are small problems that we can fix. What are we doing about small-scale farmers who need to participate in that? What are they doing in terms of storing crop? How are they participating in the markets? Now, all these line items are things that we can actually do on a very simple
Well, and
basis.
the sad part, talking about water, is the fact that even when we have enough water, there are pockets of South Africa, communities that do not have access to fresh water anywhere, clean and fresh water, irrespective.
Exactly.
Which in itself is very unfortunate. But now, I said we'll deal with these issues on a one-by-one basis, and we'll come back to putting them all together. The minimum wage of 3,500. What is it seeking to address, and will it be effective enough in that regard? Is it minimum wage for those who are already employed earning less, or is it what you should negotiate as a starting base when you employ a person?
Sure. And I think in our business, so we've been saying at Nasccence, one of the things is, if you were planning a strategy, you started the question, what is the question you are trying to answer? So were we thinking about inequality? Were we thinking about poverty? Were we thinking about redistribution? What is it that we were trying to achieve when we started talking about minimum wages? And what did we have in place? And I think this is the question that still has not been answered. If we were thinking about inequality, clearly 3,500 is not anywhere near actually addressing that problem.
Sure.
If we were thinking about poverty, have we addressed what is actually the number that would help us to get into a level where people feel they're actually above poverty when they have a job? But at the same time, looking at what the minimum wage can do, does it actually affect other things in the economy? For example, and I think this is a very critical point, and for me as a business person, I always feel that this is one of the things that get forgotten. The Deputy President said, and many other people were arguing in this issue, said, one of the things we're going to do is that if this is too high, then we will exempt certain people, so farmers. As a small business, if it is set at that level, and then they exempt small businesses, I can assure you nobody's going to come work for me because I'm exempted from the minimum wage, and they will go somewhere else, which means actually I'll completely go out of business because I can't attract talent. So the kind of thinking also, when we are actually addressing this is to say, what exactly are we trying to achieve? What are the side effects of this? And I think we haven't actually thought those things. Hopefully that will come through.
But here's another thing. I saw a statistic in one of the newspaper reports suggesting that a substantial number, up to 50,000 South Africans, it is suggested, earn less than 2,000 rands a month anyway.
Sure.
And of course, a smaller percentage, probably 1% or less, and maybe 50% of total incomes in the country at the moment.
And we have to ask ourselves, actually, what does that actually mean? Why is that the problem we have? Now, I like to actually argue that one of the problems we've had is this idea of racism, right? Because how does a company look at themselves and say, there will be somebody paid this much and somebody paid that little, and that actually they're not deserving, even though they actually have a contribution to the ways in which we make profits. And, research is coming out very clearly now in terms of saying, in behavioral economics especially, how do people interact with each other? So, how we strategically exchange ideas and, funds and all of that. And the research is saying, black people are thought to be less than, they are thought to be non-strategic and less deserving of considerations in the financial sense. And so one of the issues, therefore, that we are facing is to say, when an employer makes that decision, it's not so much that they think, oh, this is your contribution to the business, but they just think, well, you're actually not that worthy. And so actually all the minimum wage discussions we have, as scientific as they may be, don't address the fundamental problem of how actually people are looking at each other. And I think it is probably one of the biggest things that we have got to do, because it's very difficult to see why it is that, we could have such a discrepancy, and still talk about profits. And how are we not closing that when we are thinking about making sure that we stabilize
But there are certain
the economy?
types of jobs now, and, one can go anywhere with this. Let's say we have minimum wage now of 3,500. Will that apply, for instance, in the case of domestic workers? Because you have wage levels for domestics set by the Department of Labor, which is a part of government anyway, and they are nowhere near 3,500 rands a month.
And this has been the interesting thing as well, that of course we've had these sectoral determinations, that each sector, goes into bargaining council and the labor unions, and they determine. Some of them are much higher than 3.5. Of course, some of them are lower than that. And how does that actually affect that? How does it actually move into that system? People have said, well, actually, if you're higher than that, you will have to stay there. One of the things we'll see are really actually dramatic violations of that, because part of a whole minimum wage problem is that people negotiate outside of the legislation, because they say, look, I can actually, Modise has decided to give me a job on television. This is the thing, he says he can pay me. If he doesn't pay me that, I will be without a job. Then I sit and I negotiate with him. I say, look, actually I'll violate. I'm happy to actually earn 2.5. Because those are the kind of negotiations. So one of the things that we have been doing in legislation is that, there's two kinds of legislation. There's legislation that forces you to do something, and legislation that actually punishes you for doing something. And I think where we need to be is where we actually punish people for bad behavior rather than to force them to do something. And a lot of that we haven't actually done.
Now, what is the cost of living in South Africa? Shouldn't that be used as a way of determining how much people should earn? And let's say take a family of 4, 6, whatever, 5, and then say, how much do people need? How much money should a family earn of 5 to say they at least have a basic quality of life?
There are two things with that. The first one is that if you look at, it depends on the geography, how poor you are, how rich you are. So poor people, for example, if you went to Limpopo, the inflation rate that came out yesterday for Limpopo was 8.2%. If you went to Gauteng, it was about less than, I think, Western Cape about less than 5%, that's 6%. Because depending on where you are, what is in your basket of spending. So already there's a whole discrepancy there. But secondly, why would you be able to actually put what a family needs on the employer? Because the employer will only want to pay for what the value they're getting.
Exactly.
It makes it very difficult for them to say, well, you work for me, but I must actually see how many people are in your business.
Yeah.
And we've failed, the government has failed in this thing called social wage, where actually what the employer pays you is the value you derive, but also because you pay taxes, the government provides for transport, which is cheap, so that you can, or accessible at least, so that your money doesn't all go to transport, a health system so that you don't have to go to private doctors, a schooling system that doesn't force you to go and buy private education, so that whatever you earn from your employer is actually sufficient for you to meet, clothing and food and all of that.
Basic needs of a family.
Of a family, and that everything else is actually at a level that is affordable.
But
our problem is that it's much more dramatic than that in terms of what...
We spoke about
social
planning
issues.
and policies earlier on. With all of those, there's prioritization. 27% of people who should be employed are able-bodied, are not children, and are not pensioners, are not participating in the economy. And then, of course, the minimum wage has been announced. This thing has been worked on for some time. Where do you think government should focus its attention? Where should we prioritize as a system? Is it to create employment in order to absorb the 27% people who are unemployed? It's actually much more than that, because there's an additional 10% or thereabouts that have given up looking for work. My understanding, is that correct?
Absolutely. There are 5 million people who are not economically active. So they're just sitting, they're not in school, they are not in employment, they're just sitting around.
So where should the priority be then?
Very clearly, so government cannot create jobs. And I think this is something that we've learned over time. We've been promised by the government since President Zuma, for example, came in. I think even before him, President Mbeki would say, we're going to create jobs. Government cannot create jobs, clearly. This doesn't happen. They had a target, I think, in 2009 of 2 million jobs a year, whatever, I can't remember what it was. One of the things that government can create the conditions in which you and I can actually create jobs. And those conditions are not being met because there are all sorts of issues about business feeling as if they can't. So as a business person, I think, is it the right environment for me to hire more people? Does that, in this political environment, in this economic environment? And so government can actually do a number of things where the economic environment is stable, that we feel as a people that, opportunities are starting to open up, the legislation is fair, tax rates are also good. And that if I look at myself over the next 3 years, I think, I'm not going to choke myself if I hire 3 people. The environment that we're in now is such that actually people keep saying government is on the private sector is on an investment strike, by which they mean they have no confidence in the economy, and so they're holding back because they don't know, the risks are too many. And that's true of people who want to build houses. If you've got some money that you saved and you want to borrow a little bit more from the bank, you say, is this the right time for me to actually use my savings, or should I actually hold it back just to see how things will turn out? And this is a problem because actually if the person had actually gone out and built their house, they would have hired contractors. Those contractors would have, went to buy to the next door, and the spaza shop buys sweets next door. All those kinds of things that happen so that actually people get employed and there's economic activity. In the environment that we're in, people are holding back because they're quite afraid.
But as a system, as a nation, what should we be concerned with? Is it the high unemployment number, or is it a low minimum wage?
High unemployment number, that people have to be actively involved, because the low minimum wage, people get paid at these low rates because employers think that people are desperate for work, and therefore they can pay that, because if you don't take it, somebody else will.
And what is the implication of that? That if people are being paid less than 3,500, they have to increase the salaries to 3,500? Is that what it means?
That's absolutely what it means. That the minimum wage, by law, you may not pay people below that. That's the
So what's
floor.
going to happen to the minimum wages in the domestic sector, for instance, domestic worker sector?
It's very interesting, but they have to be raised up, which is actually where we've actually been losing some jobs according to the numbers of the
Well, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to say, because it's not recognized, there's no incentive to employ a person to provide you with those services. They're going to lay off people there anyway.
Yes. Or just violate it. I think a lot of people are just going to violate it. We've been violating it anyway. Because we haven't gone to the nub of the problem. People are just going to violate it, and the government does not have, the regulatory or the monitoring capacity to look and see if that works. I mean, people will be queuing at the CMA all the time, trying to actually sort out the idea that the millions and millions
So
of
it
people
might be
getting
creating more problems than actually solving them. But anyway, it's a very complicated challenge, but it requires attention on an ongoing basis after all. I mean, we have an emergency situation, as far as I'm concerned, I'm sure you'll agree, to have almost 40% of people who should be participating meaningfully in the economy not being part of it will never guarantee long-term stability.
Not at all.
Xhanti Payi, thank you very much. Much appreciated. Well, you can weigh in, share your views with us, write to us. The address is tonight@modise.tv if you're sending us email. And of course, your comments on Twitter are always welcome @TimModise.